In the realm of mental health, there are concepts ranging from well understood to as yet undiscovered. But between those areas, there exists a world of things that we don't even have a name for yet, an area of study or constellation of symptoms so poorly researched that they are indeed at the outer limits of professional conversation, despite the fact that they've been known to us for over a century. And into this I bring you a single word, aphantasia. Derived from the Greek words a, meaning without, and phantasia, meaning imagination. Together they label a phenomenon first reported in 1880, but remained nameless and virtually unstudied until less than a decade ago. Aphantasia now stands as a name for a condition in which people either have an extreme difficulty or even a complete inability to conjure voluntary mental imagery. It's important to note that, despite what the name suggests, a lack of mental imagery does not actually equate to a lack of imagination. I was a professional artist for 3 years. Being real, it's probably safe to say that I've spent most of my life daydreaming, but it is equally important to point out the difference between voluntary and involuntary imagery. I can still dream, as can most of the people with aphantasia I've spoken to. It might be best to describe this phenomenon as one which impacts the conscious mind as opposed to dreams which spawn primarily from the subconscious. No one knows what causes aphantasia, and as research is barely in its infancy, you have as many theories as you have people both qualified and otherwise to postulate them. There have been links made to head injuries, while others have asserted that there might be ties to autism, with the facts undoubtedly lying somewhere in between. In my own family, there's only one other person with this odd condition, which does nothing to promote or detract from the notion that there might be a genetic component. Making matters even murkier, there aren't any real guidelines as to how to diagnose the condition, meaning that most of the people who say they have aphantasia are self-labeled. Despite the void in expert research on the topic, a new era of awareness has arisen surrounding it, with people sharing their experiences all over the internet. And that's what I intend to do here today. What I want you to do right now is think of someone close to you that you have access to a picture of right now. Your mother, father, spouse, etc. Someone you've spent a great deal of time around. Look at their picture, and now look away. Visualize their face and try to remember as many details about their features as you can. What tone is their skin, the length of their nose, the exact shape of their hair, permanent blemishes, and so on. Once you feel you've done the best you can, look at the picture again. And how'd you do? For me, I usually pick my mother or my wife. And while I can see a general outline of them in my head, it's like there's some dark film over it that not only reduces the sharpness of the picture, but also distorts it. All of this in the couple of seconds before the image slips away forever and I have to reconstruct it in my mind all over again. It should be apparent by now how limiting this is, and if not, try to imagine your 6th grade teacher writing a lesson up on the board and expecting you to recall it for the rest of your life. Imagine an English class in which you're expected to read a work of fiction. You're reading a paragraph which is setting a scene. Your eyes register the words as the details are spelled out before you. A setting of amber fields set beneath a gray sky as clouds begin to gather on the horizon. And even as I say these words, I have no solid mental image of them in my head, despite the fact that I'm the one creating this scene for you. I've never enjoyed works of fiction because they rely on visual immersion that I'm simply incapable of. And now realize that there are people out there who report less ability to visualize than my own. In a very real sense, it can be like expecting a blind person to see, and in the case of school, chastising or punishing them when they can't. The Vividness of Visual Imagery questionnaire, which I'll leave a link to below, has been used to help measure individual differences in vivid visual imagery for decades now. And while it wasn't designed with aphantasia in mind specifically, it does provide us with some starting points in terms of information gathering. This information is a framework being used today for the sake of studies, not diagnoses. This is extremely important because as it stands right now, the majority of information we have on aphantasia are the personal accounts of those who believe they have it. And with that comes not only the issues inherent to self-reporting and self-diagnosis, along with a degree of armchair neurology in which people without any medical qualifications attempt to gatekeep to differing points and purposes. The notion that aphantasia exists on a spectrum is something that most researchers accept more as a probability than a possibility. And different terms for different degrees of this issue have been proposed, though not quite codified. But just how debilitating this can be, if at all, is something that we've only just begun to scratch the surface of. The reality is that people who report these symptoms have varying degrees of success in life. As I stated before, we're talking about a concept which didn't have a name until 2015. And it was a name I hadn't heard until roughly a year later when reading an essay from Blake Ross. If the relevance of that name is escaping you right now, Blake Ross is the co-founder of Mozilla, which is the company which brought us all Firefox, and ultimately what I'm using to read this script to you right now. Currently, there's an Aphantasia subreddit with 41,000 members, and the very first comment I read on there was from an architect, and there were several other posts from fellow artists. So clearly it is possible to have aphantasia and still be successful. However, there are questions to be answered as to whether or not special considerations should be made to facilitate that success. While I was attending a normal school, I was a D average student, and I personally believe this was at least partially due to the fact that recalling data, which I was expected to have memorized, was exceedingly difficult. By contrast, later on I transferred to an alternative school where they just plop a book down in front of me and say, read this, do it. And I made straight A's for the rest of my school career. There are levels of success that each of us are capable of, despite whatever limitations we have. And it seems exceedingly foolish to disregard the struggles of the next generation of potential innovators, artisans, or any of the other people who enrich our lives simply because we might have to rethink institutions or methodologies which we've become comfortable with. And it's with that sentiment in mind that I believe we're long overdue to have a conversation about the ways we've conventionally viewed the mind and people in general. There's a notion in cultures all over the world that either you're broken or functional, and it's my assertion that when your conventions are so narrow in scope that they are the things which are broken. Aphantasia is a new word to describe something which may have been with us since the dawn of our species. It represents limitations which are clear and often profound, and yet isn't something which stops the possibility of profound success. People learn how to cope with adversity all the time, and there's a responsibility we have to ourselves and others to ensure that people have those coping mechanisms, along with the time and freedom in which to implement them.